Hi everyone, welcome back. This is going to be a very quick video focusing on how to remove objects from arrays or remove elements from arrays. And in order to be able to talk about deleting objects from arrays, we kind of need something to work with. In the interest of time here, I've just kind of quickly written a short little program. I'm going to walk you through it briefly, just so we don't have to type it down all over again. And then we will focus on the new concept, which is deleting elements from the array. So this is the program we have to work with. We have a variable called bubble image. That variable in preload is being created. It's loading an image called bubble.png, which is simply a PNG of a transparent bubble that I've added to my sketch here. And then I've created a simple class called bubble, just so we have something to play with in this program. In the constructor of the class, I defined three attributes on the bubble, an x, y, and diameter attribute, and I make those values random for simplicity. So the position of the bubbles are random and their diameters are random as well. And then the bubble has a draw function inside of it that simply takes the bubble image object and then draws it at that bubble's position. And uses the bubble's diameter to set the size. And then in draw, in our main program, we have a couple things. So here, every time frame count is a multiple of 100, and we can tell using the modulo command. Every time frame count is a multiple of 100, we're going to add a new bubble over time. So we already know how to do that using the push command on the bubbles array, right? So we have this bubbles array over here. So this is going to add a new bubble over time. So we keep adding objects to this array. And afterwards, we say, write this for loop using the shortened syntax here. It's going to say for every bubble, right, inside the array bubbles, just tell that bubble to draw itself. And this is what the code is currently doing. All right. So having done this, what we're going to talk about here is how would we actually take some bubbles away? How would we delete objects from this bubbles array? This is a really important, useful concept, especially for a lot of the games you might be writing for your final projects. Let's say you have a game where an aiming game where the player has to, click some objects to get them to disappear, or maybe you have, a brick breaker kind of game where you have an object in your game that has to hit some bricks and those bricks have to disappear. So most likely all these game objects are being stored inside arrays. So being able to remove things is going to be really, really important. So for this example, we're going to do something simple where whenever I press, I use mouse pressed, right? So we're going to define the mouse press function. And we want to be able to say, whenever I click on a bubble, let's delete that bubble. Let's take it out of the list. So the first thing we have to figure out is, how do we know if the mouse cursor is inside a bubble? Well, this is actually very easy. We know the bubble's position. We know the mouse cursor's position. So if it's inside or not is simply a distance check. We're going to measure, and if the distance is less than the radius of a bubble, we know we're inside. Okay? So let's add this functionality to our bubble class. Let's call it isMouseInside. We're going to add a function to the bubble object that's going to say, first check the distance between the mouse and my position, right? And then we're going to do a simple check. We're going to say if that distance is less than my radius, which is half the diameter, we're going to return true. This bubble is going to say, yes, the mouse is inside. Otherwise, we're going to return false. Okay? So this now gives the bubble object the ability to tell us, is the mouse cursor inside of it or not? And then having done this, we're then going to write some code inside mouse press that's going to iterate over all the bubbles that we have and then check, is the mouse inside every bubble? We're going to ask the question for all of them. And if it is, we're going to simply remove that bubble from the list. Okay? Now, the way that we remove objects from arrays in JavaScript, we need to know the index of the object we want to remove. That means when we iterate, we cannot use this shorthand syntax. We actually need to know the index of the variable. So we're going to write our for loop using kind of the old-fashioned counter method. So we're going to say, create a counter called I, and we're going to use bubble.length as our condition, and we're going to increment in steps of 1. And then at each step of the way, we are going to say if bubbles bracket I dot is mouse inside. This is the function we just made in our class, and that's going to return true if the mouse is inside that bubble. If that's the case, then we want to delete that bubble. And the syntax to do this is we're going to use a function called splice on the array object. So notice this is very important here. We're not using that function on the individual array element. We're calling that function on the entire array. So I'm going to say bubbles.splice, just like we do bubbles.push over here. So push adds object. Splice is going to allow us to kind of cut objects from the array. And splice takes two parameters. One is the index. The other one is the number of things to remove. Okay. So with splice, you can actually remove entire sections of an array, but in this case, we're just going to remove one element at a time. If I put 2 in there, it would remove the 2 elements starting at index I or whatever the number is. But here we're going to say just remove one object at a time starting at index I. So let's run this code and see what happens. So at first glance, this looks like things are working just fine. I can click the bubbles and the bubbles are going to disappear. Okay. And this is fine when, in this case, if I'm only ever finding one bubble, right, that is inside the mouse, there won't be an issue. As more bubbles appear, right, and sometimes we might get some overlapping bubbles, we might have this condition trigger more than once as we iterate through the array. And this is where we have to be a little bit careful when we remove objects from an array. It can be difficult to replicate that condition. Like here, it might even work. If I click the 2 of them, they both disappear. But if I keep doing this for a while, there might be cases where there's glitches that happen. And like some bubbles might get missed. Some bubbles might actually, see, I clicked here on this one and that one did not disappear. So it looks like it's working, but there's this insidious little weirdness that can happen sometimes. And that is because of what happens to the array when we actually splice elements from it. Let me demonstrate here by opening the console, developer console, and just basically create, I'm just going to clear all that, create an array here just to show you what happens. So I'm going to make an array here called A, just going to put some numbers in it. Okay, so I have an arbitrary array called A that has 6 elements. Okay? So imagine if I was to remove the first element from the array at index 0, okay, I would do this by saying a.splice index 0 and then remove one element. Okay? This is what I would be left with, this array A. Okay? And now the value 2 is now at index 0. Okay? So when you delete something from an array, everything else afterwards kind of shifts back, right? So it doesn't leave an empty gap, it shrinks the array. So this is a bit of a problem if we're iterating through the array in a forward fashion. Once we delete an object from the array, right, that the next time the loop repeats, in that index position will be the next object over. So what's going to happen is we're going to end up skipping objects sometimes, depending on how things line up, right? If I have a lot here, sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. And you may be like, why is that? Well, again, that's because if we iterate forward through the array, we run the risk of missing objects because we're going to be shrinking the array as we delete things from it. So how do we fix that? How do we make sure that our loop that iterates through the array that also removes objects from the array is bulletproof? Well, there's a simple answer to this. We're simply going to walk backwards through the array instead of walking forwards. And this is going to eliminate the potential for that problem completely. The reason why is because if we start from the last element, right, if we delete something along the way, we'll know that we've already visited all the previous elements because we started from the end, right? So that if the array kind of shrinks as we delete things, if we walk backwards through it, we're never going to run into that problem. This problem is going to become a lot more apparent. You can test that for yourself. But sometimes, I'm going to click some bubbles and they should disappear and they don't, right? So we're going to make sure this never happens. We're going to just shift our thinking around this for loop here. So instead of counting forward, we're going to count backwards. How do we do this? Well, simple. We're going to start our counter at the last value. So this is bubbles.length -1. We're going to change the repeating condition to be greater or equal to 0. We want to keep looping as long as we're above 0. And we're going to decrease I by 1. Okay, so this is very important. We're going to count backwards. It looks like it might be working some of the times. If you don't do that, But in practice, you run the risk of having really annoying situations where you're going to be skipping elements in your array if you delete them while you iterate forward, right? Because the next time the loop repeats, the index will have increased, but the array will have shrunk. So this is a very subtle but important distinction. So always get into this habit. If you're going to have a part of your code that's going to be changing the array, right, deleting objects from it, make sure that you set up your for loop so that it counts backwards, and then you'll never run into that problem. Okay, so that's it for this example, right? We saw that we can have arrays of objects, we can add to them dynamically, and we can also remove from them dynamically using the splice command, as long as we know the index of the element we want to remove. And with the caveat that if we do this inside a for loop, it's a good idea to set up our for loop to count backwards instead of forwards to avoid deleting, to avoid the array shrinking on us and accidentally missing elements as we iterate forward. Okay. All right, so that's it for this example. I'll see you in the next one.